Hello there and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name's Chris and today we're taking a look at the Hawker Typhoon, which was based at RAF Bolt Head, June and July 1944. Have a look around, see what you think. There's lots to see and do. It was an amazing aircraft, one of the heaviest aircraft of the Second World War, top speed of just over 400 miles an hour, and it weighed 6.5 tons. And we're now turning to line up for the runway at the former RAF Bolt Head, and you see the cliff top just in front of us. That's 450 feet above sea level, and the aircraft and the pilot, we have to aim to land just beyond that cliff edge, the row of trees, which would have given us in a very heavy aircraft, it would have just about given us enough time to pull up and land. As you can see here, when you consider they're landing at over 100 miles an hour, it's quite incredible. So this is the approach now to the Wartime runway, which ran directly along here, around about 1,250 meters. As you can see, it's quite a short runway to make an approach to land when you would be doing well over 190 miles an hour at this point, to come over the fence at around about 180 and to touch down at 110. They just has incredible courage. We continue our approach in a westerly direction down the main runway of the former RAF Bolt Head. And as you can see, the aircraft dispersal point is on the right hand side. There's two blister hangars there which are very noticeable. We'll continue on flying down, and now we're taking a look at some of the Typhoons that were flying from here. Now I would say on my behalf that the footage of the Typhoon aircraft was not taken at RAF Bolt Head, but I've tried to depict what the Typhoons looked like and what they were operating like in 1944. There were 3 squadrons here in 1944. They were 263 Squadron, 266 Squadron and 257 Squadron. 257 Squadron were on a detachment from RAF Exeter. 263 Squadron had been here a couple of years before, flying the Westland Whirlwind. They were now back flying the Hawker Typhoon. Now, this is some footage taken when the what was termed advanced landing grounds were being constructed. Now, RAF Bolt Head was in fact an advanced landing ground, and it was constructed initially on a temporary basis with coconut matting put down on the grass, then Summerfield tracking laid on the top, and those were held down by massive great steel spikes, which formed a very effective landing ground. And as you can see here, this footage I think was taken on the continent, where the Typhoons are landing on it quite happily. Now we approach the former RAF Bolt Head, and this is the well, many people would know them as guardhouses, but the correct term for them in their day was picket post. And this is where the RAF regiment would be on guard, and they would filter out and control who was coming to and fro. Now these small picket posts were 16 feet by 18 feet, and as you can see, these particular little guardhouses were quite cosy, to say the least, but they had a stove in them, they had a little guard room, and they were very effective at the time. Now you can see it circled here at the entrance to the aerodrome, so it's right in the centre of the arrival where all the air crew, all the personnel would be arriving, and from here they could be directed to whichever part of the aerodrome they were going to. This is at a picket post that was at RAF Portreath, and you can see here the picket post circled, and just on the right hand side you can see the aircraft that were dispersed around in the parking area at the time. Now as we go through the gate, we approach onto the main part of the aerodrome, and here's a Typhoon that was parked at the time. And this is a 266 Squadron Hawker Typhoon. Hopefully it's interesting to look at the to how RAF Bolt Head looked back in the 1944 time and how it looks in its present day form. Now obviously there's nothing much left from the Second World War, but there are some buildings dotted about which are still very, very recognisable, and one of them we'll be taking a look at very, very shortly. But we continue to look down on the runway layout of the former RAF Bolt Head, which is where the Typhoons were based in 1944. Looking around now out towards the east, and this is the dispersal area where the aircraft were parked, and the road going down the centre of the image there is going right the way down the perimeter track, all the way around to that mast in the distance, which was where RAF Hope Cove, the radar station, was located. And strangely that it was called RAF Hope Cove, but I think that was based on the fact that most of the personnel were billeted in Hope Cove village, so it was a familiar name, but not very geographically familiar for people who know the area. So this is RAF Hope Cove. We're back at the picket post again, at the entrance to the airfield, and some photographs taken at RAF Bolt Head back in the 1940s. But sadly this is now gone. We're looking across the road at what was the domestic site, and this was where all the mess huts were built. This is a sergeant's ablutions block that was there right up until the 1980s. And has now been converted into a small office. And you can see the domestic site circled in red, which is where all the canteens, all the facilities for feeding all the RAF personnel on the site.
The engine was a Sabre, 24-cylinder. It wasn't reliable, and the consequence was that a number of people had to make forced landings.
The pilot calmly discusses his ordeal with other members of his squadron.
The Typhoon was a far more powerful machine than the Spitfire, as you'd expect. There were only, I think the Spitfire had a Berlin engine at 12 cylinders, and the Typhoon had a Sabre engine, Napier Sabre engine with 24 cylinders.
We're going to walk across the road now to the signal office, which was located here. And this is a very interesting building that still stands to this very day. And you can see the outline of the building had these concrete structures that were filled with earth to form a blast wall around the signal station itself. And then when we look further into the inside of the building, there was a signal office room built inside that concrete perimeter. And you can see how effective those concrete structures were, completely filled with earth. And some photographs here of the ground personnel and some of the pilots taken at RAF Bolt Head. But this particular structure, as I said, it still stands today, and it's only just across the road from where the main runway was, but far enough away that it wasn't in any danger. But it's still, and in fact the roof on it was a post-war edition, so it wouldn't have had that roof structure on it as it's shown there. And you can see in the hangar here how large the Hawker Typhoon was, with a 41-foot wingspan, weighing almost 7 tons, with a prop of 14 feet in diameter.
Until subsequently I was posted back to England, where I joined 198 Fighter Squadron, who were flying Typhoons, the Typhoon IB. Bit of a frightening experience really to start with, because the first time that you flew in one was your solo, you might say. Takeoff speed was about 130 miles an hour before she got unstuck. Coming into land, coming over the fence at about 180 miles an hour, 200 to 180 miles an hour, and touching down at about 110.
I'm just going to relay some of the build-up to 263 Squadron arriving at RAF Bolt Head in July 1944, and to give you a brief history of what the squadron got up to during the earlier part of the Second World War, which I think you'll find very interesting. It's February 1944, and the pilots of 263 Squadron had just completed their first sorties on their new Typhoons. However, no one could predict that events would render them non-operational within just a few weeks. Members of 263 Squadron, after their month of mishap, which was in July 1944, as Squadron Leader Robert Rutter is in command, who'd taken over on June the 15th. But there was to be tragedy to follow. We'll go back to December, to start with, we'll go back to December 1943, when 263 Squadron began converting from the twin-engine Westland Whirlwind, which they were also flying at RAF Bolt Head a couple of years before, and they were converting onto the Hawker Typhoon. On February the 1st, 1944, they were declared operational, and days later began flying sorties from RAF Bewley in Hampshire. However, if the squadron's pilots thought that the first month of operations on the new type would be a quiet one, they were about to get a shock. On January the 24th, 1944, 263 Squadron flew from RAF Fairwood Common in South Wales to Bewley. However, the winter weather meant that a shipping reconnaissance scheduled for February the 2nd was aborted due to thick cloud, and 3 dive bombing operations against targets in Cherbourg were also cancelled. Weather also prevented sorties being flown on February the 4th, but at last, on the 5th, 263 Squadron could fly. 6 operations were flown that day. V1 launch sites were attacked twice, with damage done. However, an anti-shipping strike off Cherbourg that night, flying officer Norman Blakelock failed to return. It was the squadron's first Typhoon loss, and the cause of Blakelock's demise has never been determined. The last that was heard from him was a radio transmission, "I'm going into," and then searchers found no trace of him nor his aircraft. I fully appreciate the story is jumping around a bit, but what I'm trying to do is just relay some of the actions of 263 Squadron, both flying the Westland Whirlwind, which they did earlier in the war at RAF Bolt Head, and also later converting on to the Hawker Typhoon, which they then returned eventually in July 1944 to fly from RAF Bolt Head.
Possibly the greatest and the most explosive, literally, extra added to the Typhoon's armoury would be the 60-pound rocket, and would be released by Typhoons in great waves of explosive rocketry across the sky. A maximum of 8 of these weapons could be carried, and their primary purpose was for the destruction of tanks and other soft-skinned vehicles.
The 11th of September 1941 at Duxford Aerodrome in Cambridgeshire.
My first meeting with the Typhoon was at Duxford in 1942. We were in the first Typhoon wing, and eventually we went on operations, but they were peripheral operations. They're going mainly along the French coast with the object of a customer asked to flying in the Typhoon on operations and avoiding, they hoped, and successfully, avoiding an aircraft being shot down and being taken to pieces by the Germans. Instrument. It was big and about twice the size of a Spitfire, I should think, and it had very clumsy attributes, such as a car-type door and a window which could be wound down rather like a car door.
On February the 10th, 1944, the weather allowed for a long-range operation to be flown over western France. 8 aircraft led the way by Squadron Leader Warnes, who took off at 1 p.m, and they crossed the channel at 0 feet before climbing to 6,000 feet on crossing the French coast. They flew to Isigny-sur-Mer via Rennes and Gale before heading home. Flight Sergeant Ian Dunlop's aircraft was hit by light flak, forcing him to land early at RAF Warnwell in Dorset. 2 days later, a similar mission, again led by Squadron Leader Warnes, left Beaulieu for Portland and on to Sillon de Talbert on the northern tip of Brittany. Once there, they turned towards Gel and its Luftwaffe base. On the approach to the village, they spotted a DO-217. An unusual encounter in daylight. Warnes recorded, "I was leading the squadron at 0 feet in loose line abreast, with myself to port. At 2:57 we were flying east about 5 miles south of Gale when I saw a DO-217 approaching to port at about 150 feet. I called my section to follow and turned towards the enemy aircraft, which turned away from me to the north, then east, then south. The enemy aircraft took evasive action in gentle turns at 0 feet at high speed. I fired short bursts at various ranges and deflections. At first I got strikes only on the wing, then a dull glow appeared in the centre section and the enemy aircraft pulled sharply up to 1,000 feet. I closed to 200 yards and fired a long burst, which made pieces fly off. I saw the crew of 6 bail out. The parachutes opened as they left the enemy aircraft. The enemy aircraft then crashed with a remarkably large explosion. There was return fire from the dorsal position, one round entering the leading edge of my starboard tailplane, causing minor damage. Meanwhile, the 5 other Typhoons were shooting at whatever they could, and Racine claimed 3 109s which burst into flames following his attack run. The Typhoons then headed for Montségur airfield, and from what happened there is perhaps best explained by a report filed by the commanding officer of the Leish Flak Battalion 996 Flak Unit. 6 unknown single-engine aircraft were spotted at 4:25. Taking advantage of the Osim Valley, they approached shot in lowest level. The flak alarm sounded and was given immediate attention.
We did have a problem with the aircraft engine, with carbon monoxide. It wasn't really the engine, it was the design of the aircraft. Drew the engine nacelles were forward, as is natural, and then the design drew a lot of the frames inside the cockpit. And so we had to fly at all times with oxygen.
We're now back in the lower centre of the domestic side at the former RAF Bolt Head, and we're taking a look at a handcraft hut that still remains to this day and which was used as a sergeant's mess, corrugated structure roof. And when we walk around to the what was the entrance, we will be able to take a look inside and see that it was in fact lined with flat asbestos sheeting. This is a photograph of how it looked more close to when it was in its wartime era, before the doors were changed. The entranceway was changed and really sadly taken away, and this sort of garage door was built. But this is the inside of the handcraft hut, and as you can see, it's lined by flat asbestos sheeting. The handcraft huts are made from 7 sides each of the 7 sides in asbestos sheeting, which are then bolted together to form this unique and recognisable shape. They were manufactured by the Universal Asbestos Manufacturing Company Limited of Watford for use as airfield accommodation from 1942 onwards.
Napier's Sabre was the attempt to bolt 2 engines together and drive them through a common drive shaft. Unfortunately for everybody concerned, although it looked good on paper, the Sabre would start to suffer from certain problems. The first of these would be problems with the oil feed. This would become clogged and cause the engine to overheat and eventually to seize, causing our intrepid pilot to either abandon his aeroplane or follow it down into the crash landing.
The handcraft hut was advertised as an 18-foot span, temporary construction with a length of 36 feet, which could be adjusted upon requirements. It consisted of 3 handcraft reinforced asbestos cement double-cranked units measuring 4 feet wide by 12 feet long. The exterior has a distinctive shape similar to the Nissen hut but 7 size. The interior walls were lined with asbestos cement-lined sheets.
I had the distinction of being shot down not far from Boulogne.
I was really scared, scared stiff on many, many occasions.
It happened more than once that a tail came off the machine, and at that time nobody whose tail came off survived.
At times I was shit scared. He said, well, you'll only be about an hour and a half. Won't take very long. In fact, it took just about 12 months.
I really hope you've enjoyed this journey back in time to take a look at the activities of the Typhoon squadrons here back in 1944, and also taking a look around, a rather in-depth look in some ways around the former RAF Bolt Head, and looking at what structures remain to this day and how it must have looked back in the day. I really thank you if you've reached and watched this far, because I think without doubt this has been one of my more lengthy films I've put together, but because of the history of RAF Bolt Head, I really felt that it was well worthwhile to try and include as many photographs and information about the former aerodrome as I possibly could. But in any event, take the greatest of care, and I thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next film. All the very best. Cheers for now.